Look, we're diving straight into some incredibly heavy but absolutely crucial history today. We're going to walk through an unflinching explainer of the foundational atrocities of the Americas. Specifically, we'll be confronting the staggering death tolls of both indigenous populations and Black Americans, and looking closely at how the architecture of those exact atrocities echoes directly into our present day. We're drawing upon David Stannard's definitive work, American Holocaust, firsthand atrocity records from Exterminate Them, the 17th century Jesuit relations, and the modern structural analysis found in the 400-year Holocaust. Make no mistake, this is sober, unsanitized history, but understanding this source material is vital if we want to grasp how these systems actually work. Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start with the scale of annihilation, move into the infrastructure of mass killing, examine the California extermination, look at the 400-year Holocaust, define modern genocide, and wrap up with truthful acknowledgement. Let's start right at Chapter 1, the scale of annihilation. Historical demographers have uncovered a number that is just hard to wrap your head around. The post-Columbian depopulation rate across the Americas was a catastrophic 95%. As David Stannard points out, this is widely considered the worst demographic disaster in the entire history of our species. To put that 95% into perspective on a human level, it means that on average, for every 20 Native individuals alive at the moment of European contact, only one single person stood in their place when that initial bloodbath and biological invasion were over. And this brilliantly illustrates how this historical devastation isn't just an isolated event locked in the past. It's a continuous condition. As outlined in the 400-year Holocaust, this foundational destruction laid down the exact blueprint for a perpetual racial genocide and systemic deprivation applied to Black Americans over 4 centuries. The author makes a really powerful point here. A perpetual state of deprivation and terror isn't just incidental to American culture. It essentially is the culture. Moving to Chapter 2, Infrastructure of Mass Killing. David Stannard's meticulous scholarship completely dismantles this popular, romanticized idea that the mass destruction of Native societies was just an accident or the unintended consequence of disease. Instead, he proves it was a deliberate holocaust, one that was intentionally driven by fanatical religious and juridical rationales designed specifically to justify absolute subjugation. The conquerors essentially weaponized everything at their disposal to make this happen. On one side, they used Catholic and Protestant religious mandates, literally claiming God wanted indigenous peoples destroyed as a punishment for their sins. Then, on the other side, they layered on legal frameworks, reaching all the way back to Aristotle's concept of natural slaves to classify Native people as subhuman beasts of burden. According to the texts, this dual approach provided the perfect legalistic cover for seizing their land, extracting their gold, and working them to death in mines. You see this dark infrastructure laid bare in the 17th century missionary records known as the Jesuit relations. The missionaries actually documented their own debates over whether indigenous people were literal slaves to the devil or sorcerers. And while they sat around debating theology and forcing cultural assimilation, European conquerors on the ground were using hundreds of Dutch firearms to systematically accelerate the extermination and expatriation of the native tribes. Let's narrow our focus for Chapter 3, the California extermination. When we look at the first-hand historical accounts compiled and Exterminate Them, the focus shifts from those abstract legalities to the brutal, state-sponsored reality right there on the ground. When white miners flooded into California for the gold rush, they brought a worldview that saw Native Americans strictly as obstacles to be eradicated. Newspapers and civic leaders weren't hiding this. They literally advocated for a war of extermination in plain ink. Just look at the drop here. Before the gold rush in 1846, the Native population in California was at least 120,000. By the 1860s, just a little over a decade later, it had plummeted to somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000. That means roughly 100,000 human beings died in a flash. And the sources detail that they didn't just quietly fade away. They were the victims of outright murder, state-sponsored militia massacres, forced starvation after their ecosystems were deliberately destroyed, and legalized enslavement. The crucial takeaway here is how deeply incentivized this extermination was by everyday economic exploitation. For example, white retailers used a fraudulent 2-ounce weight they called a digger ounce. They'd use this to buy gold from Native miners, tricking them and ensuring they only paid half of what the gold was actually worth. This kind of casual, everyday economic theft happened right alongside California state laws that established an indentured system, which, let's be clear, was just legalized Indian slavery. Which brings us to Chapter 4, the 400-year Holocaust.
To really understand how this carries forward to Black America, we have to look at how the 400-year Holocaust maps these exact structures of white supremacy onto a continuous framework. We absolutely have to distinguish between individual racism, the overt camera-ready acts of violence, and institutional racism. Institutional racism is about the covert, legally protected acts by the dominant community against the Black community. It's subtle, it's harder to point to one specific person committing the act, but the author argues it is entirely systematic and every bit as destructive to human life.
When you lay these two historical tracks side by side, the transition is seamless and, quite frankly, chilling. The legalized murder of Indigenous people through extermination bounties parallels perfectly with the Casual Killing Act of 1669 applied to enslaved Black people. Legalized Indian slavery maps directly onto Jim Crow and modern mass incarceration. And those unpunished militia massacres of the 1850s, they laid the direct groundwork for the unchecked police violence we still see in the news today.
The historical record shows us that from the Casual Killing Act onward, turning a living Black body into a mutilated or dead one wasn't just legally protected, it was completely culturally normalized. And if Black people dared to resist this terror, well, the legal system was explicitly designed to execute them. The texts make a profound argument here. This wasn't a failure of the justice system. The system was functioning exactly the way it was built to function. Let's look at Chapter 5, Defining Modern Genocide. Consider this stark piece of modern evidence for a second. 21. Black men are a staggering 21 times more likely to be murdered in a police encounter than their white counterparts. The authors argue this is absolutely not some statistical anomaly. It is the direct, mathematical continuation of the systemic devaluation of Black life that was established centuries ago. And when we measure this against the actual clinical definition of genocide, including the strict parameters of the UN Genocide Convention, we see it actively occurring today. As Standard points out, the U.S. government oversees the ongoing dissolution of Native families and willfully refuses to address life-destroying poverty on reservations. Simultaneously, Black Americans face unceasing emotional terror, systemic pathologizing, and the pressure of forced assimilation. Make no mistake, these are textbook, internationally recognized markers of genocide.
Finally, Chapter 6, Truthful Acknowledgement.
Any real acknowledgement has to start with this brilliant framing from W.E.B. Du Bois. We have to recognize the ultimate, legally sanctioned degradation of humans as literal property. A white factory worker back in the day might have faced terrible conditions, sure, but he was never real estate. That unique designation as property created an existence rooted entirely in systemic oppression, an oppression that persists in institutional forms to this very day. The sources make a really critical point here. It is deeply irresponsible to romanticize our history. The perpetrators of this systemic violence have literally spent centuries socializing the public to ignore, minimize, or even unconsciously participate in this continuous racial genocide. The most dangerous aspect of the 400-year Holocaust is that it happens in plain sight, all while society aggressively denies it's even happening.
So I want to leave you with this vital thought to chew on. We've seen the 95% death tolls, the legal justifications from Columbus to California, and the continuous terror mapped seamlessly onto Black America. If the infrastructure of this American Holocaust is still functioning exactly as it was originally designed to, what will it actually take for us to truly confront, acknowledge, and dismantle it? Thanks for joining this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history you've been taught.